By April 1970, the Vietnam War had entered a new and controversial phase. President Richard Nixon's Vietnamization policy aimed to gradually withdraw American combat forces while transferring responsibility for the war to South Vietnamese forces. To cover this withdrawal and maintain pressure on communist forces, American commanders implemented an aggressive strategy in the border regions near Cambodia. The 1st Cavalry Division, under Major General L.V. Roberts, received orders to conduct operations in Tay Ninh Province, northwest of Saigon near the Cambodian border. This area served as a critical infiltration route for North Vietnamese army forces moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. The division's mission was to locate and destroy enemy forces, disrupt supply lines, and prevent the NVA from massing for attacks on population centres. To accomplish this mission, division planners developed an unconventional tactical approach. Rather than establishing permanent, heavily fortified bases, artillery batteries and infantry companies would construct temporary fire support bases in the middle of known enemy territory. These bases would be deliberately vulnerable, designed to tempt the NVA into attacking. When the enemy took the bait and assaulted a firebase, massive concentrations of artillery from other nearby bases and overwhelming tactical air support would destroy the attacking force. It was a dangerous strategy, essentially using American soldiers as bait to draw the enemy into exposing themselves to superior firepower. The concept violated traditional military principles about force protection, but in the context of Vietnamization and troop withdrawals, it offered a way to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy while minimizing American forces at risk. The strategy had worked reasonably well through March 1970. Several fire bases had been attacked and held, with the NVA suffering heavy casualties, but the tactic carried inherent risks. If the enemy attacked in overwhelming force, if air support could not arrive quickly enough, if communications failed at the critical moment, the isolated firebase could be overrun. On April 1, 1970, all of those risks converged on a small, hastily constructed firebase called Fire Support Base Illingworth. Firebase Illingworth was established on March 17, 1970 by 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. The location, approximately 35 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh City, and only 5 kilometers from the Cambodian border, was chosen specifically because it sat astride known NVA infiltration routes. The firebase was named for Corporal John James Illingworth of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, who had been killed on March 14th near Tay Ninh City. He was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Naming the firebase after a recently fallen soldier was both an honour and a grim reminder of the dangers the garrison would face. The base occupied a dry pond bed, a low depression that offered minimal natural protection but provided relatively clear fields of fire. Engineers had bulldozed earth to create defensive positions. 20 bunkers were constructed into a 4-foot-high earthen berm that formed the perimeter, were each bunker designed to house a 4-man fire team with overhead cover against mortar and rocket fire. Claymore mines were positioned outside the fortifications in overlapping patterns, their overlapping kill zones designed to shred infantry attempting to breach the perimeter. Each M18A1 Claymore contained 700 steel balls backed by 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive, capable of projecting those balls in a 60-degree arc out to 50 meters. The firebase's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael J. Conrad, made a controversial decision that would later be heavily scrutinized. He elected not to surround the base with concertina wire, the traditional defensive barrier used to slow attacking infantry, and channel them into kill zones. Conrad's reasoning was tactical. He believed that determined enemy troops, particularly well-trained sappers, would breach wire obstacles anyway using Bangalore torpedoes or simply throwing assault packs on top of the wire to create crossing points. The wire might actually provide concealment for sappers approaching the perimeter, allowing them to get closer before being detected. Without wire, approaching enemy would be fully exposed crossing the open ground to the berm. This decision, while logical from one perspective, left the firebase more exposed than standard doctrine recommended. Infantry attacking across open ground would reach the defensive perimeter faster without wire to slow them. The debate over Conrad's decision would continue for years among military analysts studying the battle. Manning the firebase were elements from several units. Company C, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry provided the primary infantry defence. Company E, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry contributed its reconnaissance platoon, approximately 18 men who were among the battalion's most experienced soldiers. Troop A, 1st Squadron, 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment deployed 4 M113 armoured personnel carriers and 1 M551 Sheridan light tank to provide mobile firepower. The artillery contingent was substantial for such a small base. Battery A, 1st Battalion, 77th Field Artillery contributed 3 M114 155mm howitzers. Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery deployed 2 M110 self-propelled 8-inch howitzers, massive weapons capable of firing 175-pound shells to ranges exceeding 16 kilometres. Battery A, 1st Battalion, 30th Field Artillery, and Battery B, 5th Battalion, 2nd Field Artillery, provided 6 M102 105mm howitzers. Total garrison strength was approximately 220 American soldiers. For a firebase in such an exposed location, this was a minimal force, but that was precisely the point. The base was meant to be tempting, vulnerable enough to draw attack, but supported by enough artillery at nearby firebases to destroy any assault force. Unknown to the Americans, North Vietnamese intelligence had been closely monitoring Firebase Illingworth since its establishment. Reconnaissance teams had approached the perimeter at night, observing defensive positions, counting artillery pieces, noting the locations of bunkers and fighting positions. Agents in nearby villages reported on helicopter traffic patterns, resupply schedules, and troop rotations. The NVA were methodically gathering intelligence for a major attack. On March 26th, Company C had engaged an NVA patrol and recovered documents from a dead officer's body. Those documents included detailed sketches of Firebase Illingworth, showing the locations of artillery pieces, the tactical operations centre, communications tower, bunker positions and firing sectors. The sketches were remarkably accurate, clearly based on close observation over multiple nights. Notes indicated the locations of ammunition storage, vehicle parks, and even the positions of claymore mines. The enemy had thoroughly reconnoitred the base and was clearly planning an assault. The level of detail in the captured documents was alarming. They knew exactly where to concentrate fires to destroy command and control. They knew which sectors were most vulnerable. They knew the firebase inside and out. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad recognized the danger immediately upon seeing the captured documents. He flew by helicopter to division headquarters to request permission to relocate the firebase. His brigade commander, Colonel Robert Kingston, agreed, but Major General Roberts, the division commander, overruled the request. Roberts wanted to keep Firebase Illingworth exactly where it was. The enemy was clearly interested in attacking it, which was precisely what the strategy required. Conrad returned to his base troubled but determined to prepare his men for what was coming. He ordered 100% alert status, meaning every soldier would remain awake and at fighting positions throughout the night, rather than following normal watch rotations. He positioned ground surveillance radar to monitor the tree line for enemy movement. He coordinated fire support plans with nearby Firebase Hannes, located approximately 4 kilometers south, ensuring artillery could respond immediately if Illingworth came under attack. On the evening of March 31st, reconnaissance patrols detected increased enemy activity in the surrounding jungle. Ground surveillance radar showed multiple targets massing in the tree line approximately 500 meters from the perimeter. Conrad ordered harassment and interdiction fires, or random artillery rounds fired into likely enemy assembly areas to disrupt preparations and inflict casualties. The men of Firebase Illingworth prepared for battle. Machine gun crews checked their weapons, ensuring ammunition belts were properly loaded and linked. Artillerymen stockpiled propellant charges and projectiles near their guns for rapid firing. Infantry troops positioned grenades within easy reach and rechecked claymore mine firing devices. Everyone understood that attack was imminent. What the garrison did not fully appreciate was the scale of the threat massing in the darkness beyond their perimeter. 1st Battalion, 272nd Regiment, 9th Cavalry Division was assembling for assault. This was not a company-sized probe or a harassing attack. This was a full battalion. Approximately 400 experienced NVA soldiers, backed by heavy weapons including mortars, recoilless rifles, and rocket-propelled grenades. The North Vietnamese had studied the firebase carefully and intended to destroy it completely. At 2:17 a.m. on April 1st, 1970, the attack began. The bombardment opened with devastating precision. More than 300 rounds of mortar, rocket, and recoilless rifle fire hammered Firebase Illingworth in a concentrated barrage that lasted 20 minutes. The NVA gunners were firing from carefully surveyed positions with pre-registered coordinates. They were not shooting blindly into the darkness. They were executing a fire plan designed to destroy the base's command structure and artillery before the ground assault began. The first rounds impacted on the fire direction centre of Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery. The FDC was the nerve centre controlling artillery fire missions. 3 radio operators sleeping near the bunker were killed instantly by a direct hit. Simultaneously, multiple rounds struck the fire direction centre of 1st Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, killing 7 artillerymen. The artillery crews were effectively decapitated in the opening seconds of the attack. Fire direction centres destroyed, fire direction officers dead or wounded, communications severed. The big guns that were supposed to provide defensive fires were momentarily silenced, their crews scrambling to re-establish command and control, while incoming rounds continued to impact throughout the firebase. Specialist 4th Class Peter C. Lemon, a 19-year-old assistant machine gunner with Company E's reconnaissance platoon, was manning a defensive position on the northern perimeter when the barrage began. Lemon was a Canadian immigrant born in Toronto on June 5, 1950, who had moved to Michigan as a child and volunteered for military service. He believed in stopping the spread of communism and had willingly deployed to Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. The reconnaissance platoon held the northern sector of the perimeter, precisely where the NVA planned to focus their ground assault. As explosions erupted throughout the firebase, Lemon and his fellow soldiers pressed themselves into fighting positions and waited for what would come next. The bombardment created conditions perfect for the NVA assault. Dust and smoke from exploding rounds filled the air, reducing visibility to just a few meters. Defenders could not see beyond their immediate fighting positions. The noise was overwhelming, making verbal communication impossible. Soldiers signaled to each other with hand gestures, or simply fought as individuals, unable to coordinate with teammates. As the barrage lifted, 400 NVA soldiers rose from concealed positions in the jungle and charged toward the northern perimeter. They came in waves of approximately 40 men each, trained infantry executing a rehearsed assault plan. They knew the exact locations of American bunkers, the gaps in the defensive line, the positions of the Claymore mines. They had been preparing for this attack for days. The reconnaissance platoon opened fire with everything available. M16 rifles on full automatic, M60 machine guns sweeping their assigned sectors. Claymore mines were detonated, each mine projecting 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc, cutting down attackers in groups. Hand grenades arced through the darkness toward the enemy, but the dust created by the bombardment immediately began causing mechanical failures. M16 rifles, known for their sensitivity to fouling, started jamming after firing just a few magazines. The fine dust infiltrated the weapon's direct impingement gas systems and bolt carrier groups, causing failures to extract and failures to feed. Soldiers frantically cleared jams, pulling charging handles, tapping forward assists, ejecting stuck cartridges. M60 machine guns, more reliable than the M16s but still vulnerable to contamination, also began malfunctioning. Gunners found their weapons jamming after sustained firing. They cleared the jams and kept firing, but the interruptions in defensive fire allowed the NVA to close the distance faster than expected. Specialist Lemon was firing his M60 machine gun when it jammed. He transitioned to his M16 rifle. It jammed after just a few magazines. Both of his primary weapons were inoperable. Around him, other soldiers were experiencing the same failures. The northern perimeter's firepower was degrading rapidly. With his rifles useless, Lemon grabbed hand grenades. He began throwing them as fast as he could pull pins and release spoons. Fragmentation grenades exploded among the attacking NVA, each detonation sending shrapnel in all directions. Lemon threw grenade after grenade, and desperately trying to keep the enemy at bay. The NVA reached the berm. What had been a firefight at 50 to 100 meters became hand-to-hand combat. Enemy soldiers scrambled over the earthen wall. American defenders met them with rifle butts, entrenching tools, knives, fists. Men grappled in the darkness, fighting for their lives at arm's length. Lemon threw his last grenade. He was out of ammunition, out of explosives, armed only with his useless rifle. An NVA soldier appeared through the dust cloud directly in front of him. Lemon swung his M16 like a club, smashing the rifle into the enemy soldier's head. The man went down. Lemon hit him again to ensure he stayed down. All along the northern perimeter, similar desperate fights were occurring. Corporal Casey Waller was killed defending his position, whereas Private First Class Nathan S. Mann fell fighting. Specialist 4th Class Brent Elstreet died at his fighting position. These were Lemon's close friends, men he had trained with, fought alongside, shared the hardships of war. They died within meters of where Lemon was fighting. At 3:18 a.m., approximately 1 hour after the initial barrage began, a catastrophic explosion rocked the centre of Firebase Illingworth. An NVA sapper had infiltrated close to the firebase's ammunition storage area. Whether by design or accident, he threw a satchel charge or rocket-propelled grenade near the stockpiled artillery ammunition. The resulting secondary explosion was devastating. Approximately 190 rounds of 8-inch artillery ammunition detonated simultaneously. Each 8-inch projectile contained approximately 15 pounds of high explosive. 190 projectiles meant nearly 3,000 pounds of explosives detonating in a massive sympathetic detonation. Soldiers described the explosion as a titanic roar that drowned out all other sounds. The blast wave lifted men off the ground and threw them several meters. Shrapnel from the projectile casings scythed through the firebase in all directions, wounding Americans and NVA alike. A section of the defensive berm was blown apart, creating a breach in the perimeter. Dust, smoke, and debris filled the air so thickly that visibility dropped to zero. For several critical seconds, all firing stopped. Defenders were stunned by the blast. Temporarily deafened, struggling to regain orientation. The NVA assault force was similarly disrupted, many of their soldiers wounded or killed by the same explosion. The ammunition detonation had an unexpected effect. It shocked both sides into a momentary pause, breaking the momentum of the assault. The NVA, who had been on the verge of overwhelming the northern perimeter, fell back to regroup and assess casualties. The Americans, given a brief respite, reorganized their defenses and brought fresh troops to threatened sectors. Lemon had been wounded by the explosion, shrapnel tearing into his head, back, and neck. He was bleeding, partially deaf from the overpressure, covered in dust and debris. But he was alive and still capable of fighting. He saw wounded Americans lying in the open, unable to move to cover. Without hesitation, Lemon moved through fire to reach a badly wounded soldier. He dragged the man to the aid station, then returned to his fighting position. He found another operable M60 machine gun and resumed firing at enemy soldiers still visible in the firebase perimeter. Throughout the firebase, artillerymen who had survived the bombardment worked frantically to get guns back into action. Captain John Ahern, the artillery liaison officer from 1st Battalion, 77th Field Artillery serving as fire coordinator for 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, directed fire support from nearby firebase Hannes and other supporting bases. Ahern would later recount that he directed over 1,000 rounds of artillery fire that night, plus several airstrikes and dozens of helicopter gunship runs. The massed artillery fires from multiple firebases created a wall of steel around Illingworth, catching NVA troops in the open and forcing them to withdraw. Firebase Hannes fired flechette rounds, artillery projectiles that released thousands of small steel darts designed to saturate an area with penetrating fragments. The flechettes were devastatingly effective against infantry in the open. They tore through the NVA assault formations, inflicting casualties that mounted with each salvo. A C-119 gunships arrived overhead, their miniguns and 20mm cannons raking enemy positions. The aircraft orbited the firebase, crew chiefs identifying targets with night vision equipment and directing fire onto NVA troops attempting to regroup for another assault. Cobra attack helicopters joined the fight. Captain Joe Hogg, and flying a Cobra gunship, made repeated passes over the firebase despite heavy ground fire. When Firebase Illingworth's communications were disrupted by the bombardment, Hogg's helicopter served as an aerial relay, passing fire missions and situation reports between the besieged firebase and higher headquarters. His actions kept vital communications open during the most critical phase of the battle. By 5 a.m., less than 3 hours after the attack began, the fighting subsided. The NVA withdrew into the jungle carrying their wounded and as many of their dead as possible. They left behind 74 to 88 confirmed enemy bodies, though the actual casualty count was certainly higher given the number of wounded carried away and soldiers buried by artillery fire. At first light, Helicopters arrived to evacuate American casualties. The medevac birds landed in the center of the firebase, medics rushing wounded onto stretchers and loading them aboard for immediate evacuation to field hospitals. The scene was grim. Bodies covered with ponchos, wounded men with field dressings soaked through with blood, equipment destroyed, artillery pieces damaged. The firebase was a wreck. The final American casualty count was devastating. 24 killed in action, including 10 artillerymen who died when the fire direction centers were hit. 54 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. For a garrison of 220 men, this represented a 40% casualty rate. Among the dead were the 3 men Specialist Lemon would dedicate his Medal of Honor to: Casey Waller, Nathan Mann, and Brent Street. They were his friends, his brothers in arms, the men who had fought beside him and died defending Firebase Illingworth. Lemon himself was wounded multiple times during the battle. Shrapnel wounds to the head, back, and neck from the ammunition explosion. Additional injuries from enemy fire while exposing himself to rescue wounded comrades. He was evacuated for treatment but survived his wounds. Later that morning, Major General L.V. Roberts, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, arrived by helicopter to assess the situation. He walked through the firebase, speaking with survivors, examining the damage. He awarded a Silver Star on the spot to one soldier for conspicuous gallantry. Then he delivered news that shocked the exhausted garrison. They would have to remain at Firebase Illingworth for one more night. The men were stunned. The base had been devastated. Nearly half the garrison was casualties. The enemy knew exactly where they were and how vulnerable they remained. Staying invited another attack, but General Roberts insisted. The firebase had held. American forces had defeated a regimental-sized NVA assault. Abandoning Illingworth immediately would concede the battlefield to the enemy. They would stay. Fortunately, the NVA did not return that night. Their assault battalion had been shattered. Casualty estimates suggested they suffered over 50% losses, far beyond what any unit could sustain and remain combat effective. The survivors withdrew across the Cambodian border to reorganize and absorb replacements. On April 2nd, Firebase Illingworth was abandoned. The artillery pieces were airlifted out by heavy-lift helicopters. The remaining troops were extracted by Hueys. The bunkers were demolished. Within hours, the firebase that had been the site of one of the most intense small unit engagements of the war ceased to exist. The Battle of Firebase Illingworth generated significant controversy. The strategy of using American troops as bait to lure enemy attacks was examined closely by senior commanders. While the tactic had achieved its objective of inflicting heavy casualties on the NVA, the cost in American lives was substantial. 40% casualties were unsustainable, particularly in the context of Vietnamization and public opposition to the war at home. April 1970 became the deadliest month of that year for American forces in Vietnam, with 730 soldiers killed. April 1st alone saw NVA units shell 115 targets throughout South Vietnam and launch 13 major ground assaults. Firebase Illingworth was the costliest of those engagements for American forces. Lieutenant Colonel Michael J. Conrad's performance during the battle was closely scrutinized. Some questioned his decision to forego concertina wire around the perimeter. Others criticized the exposed ammunition storage that led to the catastrophic explosion. But Conrad had repeatedly requested permission to relocate the firebase after discovering the enemy had detailed reconnaissance information. That request had been denied by higher headquarters. Ultimately, Conrad was not blamed for the casualties. His decision to maintain 100% alert status undoubtedly prevented the firebase from being completely overrun. His coordination of fire support and leadership during the fight earned praise. He would go on to become a full colonel within a year, later promoted to brigadier general, eventually commanded the 1st Cavalry Division, and retired as a major general. He remained president of his West Point class, which also produced Brigadier General John C. Barnson and General Norman Schwarzkopf. For Specialist Peter C. Lemon, the battle was the defining moment of his life. His extraordinary actions that night, engaging the enemy with multiple weapons, throwing grenades until exhausted, fighting hand to hand, rescuing wounded comrades despite his own injuries, and continuing to fight until physically unable to continue, represented gallantry of the highest order. On June 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon presented the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Peter C. Lemon during a White House ceremony. Lemon had turned 21 just 10 days earlier. He was one of the youngest Medal of Honor recipients from the Vietnam War. The official citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Lemon, Company E, distinguished himself while serving as an assistant machine gunner during the defense of Fire Support Base Illingworth. When the base came under heavy enemy attack, Sergeant Lemon engaged a numerically superior enemy with machine gun and rifle fire from his defensive position until both weapons malfunctioned. He then used hand grenades to fend off the intensified enemy attack launched in his direction. After eliminating all but one of the enemy soldiers in the immediate vicinity, he pursued and disposed of the remaining soldier in hand-to-hand combat. Despite fragment wounds from an exploding grenade, Sergeant Lemon regained his position, carried a more seriously wounded comrade to an aid station, and, as he returned, was wounded a second time by enemy fire. Disregarding his personal injuries, he moved to another position of defensive importance, secured an operable machine gun, and continued to deliver devastating fire upon the enemy until he collapsed from his multiple wounds and exhaustion. Sergeant Lemon's gallantry and extraordinary heroism are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit on him, his unit, and the United States Army. 2 other soldiers received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for their actions at Firebase Illingworth. Multiple Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Army Commendation Medals and Purple Hearts were awarded to the garrison. For many years after the war, Lemon struggled with the meaning of his Medal of Honor. He initially considered declining the award, believing it belonged to his 3 friends who died. He kept the medal in a shoebox in his closet, unwilling to wear it publicly. When asked about it, he would say, "It isn't mine. It belongs to Casey Waller, Nathan Mann, Brent Street, and the guys in the unit." Only years later, after speaking with other veterans and wrestling with survivor's guilt, did Lemon come to accept the medal. He realized he could honor his fallen comrades by sharing their story, by explaining what happened that night, by ensuring their sacrifice was not forgotten. He began wearing the Medal of Honor not for himself but for them. Lemon became a motivational speaker, authored a book titled Beyond the Medal, and produced a PBS documentary called Beyond the Medal of Honor. He donated copies to every high school in the United States, hoping to inspire young Americans to service and citizenship. On May 1, 2009, President Barack Obama presented Lemon with the Outstanding American by Choice Award at the White House, recognizing his professional achievements and civic contributions as a naturalized citizen. The Battle of Firebase Illingworth stands as a microcosm of what the Vietnam War had become by 1970. Small units of American soldiers placed in vulnerable positions as part of strategic plans developed at division and corps level, fighting desperately against a determined enemy who had home field advantage, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to mass forces for attacks then disperse into Cambodia, where American forces could not pursue. Superior firepower and air support allowed American forces to prevail tactically in most engagements, but at costs that were increasingly difficult to justify politically back home. Each casualty report, each photograph of wounded soldiers, each news story about remote fire bases being attacked fed growing public opposition to the war. The firebase strategy worked in the narrow sense that it drew NVA forces into the open where they could be destroyed by American firepower. Your Firebase Illingworth held, the NVA battalion that attacked suffered catastrophic casualties and was forced to withdraw back into Cambodia to reorganize. Tactically, measured strictly by military metrics of casualties inflicted versus casualties sustained, it was an American victory. The kill ratio favored American forces, but the broader strategic picture was less clear and far more troubling for American policymakers. April 1970's 730 American deaths, the highest monthly total for that year, contributed to growing public opposition to the war. Images of young soldiers fighting in remote fire bases near the Cambodian border, suffering heavy casualties for patches of ground that would be abandoned days or weeks later, reinforced perceptions that the war was unwinnable, that American lives were being spent for no clear strategic gain. The tactic of using troops as bait, while militarily sound, was politically unsustainable. Vietnamization proceeded as planned. American combat forces continued withdrawing. The responsibility for defending South Vietnam increasingly fell to ARVN units. By 1973, American ground combat forces had largely departed Vietnam. The war continued without them for 2 more years, until Saigon fell in April 1975. For the survivors of Firebase Illingworth, April 1st remains what they call Thank God I'm Alive Day. Every year, veterans gather to remember their fallen comrades, to share stories, to support each other through the enduring effects of that night. The group grows smaller each year as veterans age and pass away, but the memory of what happened endures. 24 Americans died defending Firebase Illingworth. 54 were wounded. Their sacrifice bought time for Vietnamization, inflicted significant casualties on the enemy, and demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, American soldiers would fight with extraordinary courage. The battle also demonstrated the harsh realities of the strategy being employed in 1970. Using small units as bait was effective at drawing enemy attacks, but placed those units at tremendous risk. When everything worked, when fire support arrived on time, when communications held, when artillery could mass fires quickly enough, the tactic succeeded. But it required everything to work perfectly. Any failure in the system, any delay in support, any breakdown in coordination, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Firebase Illingworth came very close to being overrun. The ammunition explosion that disrupted the NVA assault was accidental, not part of any defensive plan. Had that explosion not occurred when it did, breaking the enemy's momentum at the critical moment, the outcome might have been very different. The firebase held by a combination of the garrison's courage, effective fire support, and fortune. The lessons from Firebase Illingworth were studied carefully by military planners. The firebase strategy was refined, with more attention paid to force protection, communications redundancy, and rapid reaction forces, SIST, but the fundamental tension remained: how to maintain an aggressive posture against the enemy while protecting American forces and managing casualty rates that the public would tolerate. By 1970, that balance had become nearly impossible to maintain. The political will to sustain combat operations was eroding rapidly. Vietnamization and withdrawal were not just policies, but political necessities. Firebase Illingworth demonstrated both the effectiveness of American soldiers in combat and the unsustainable nature of the war itself. The story of Firebase Illingworth is ultimately a story about courage. The courage of 220 American soldiers who defended an isolated firebase against overwhelming attack. The courage of artillerymen who worked their guns under fire to support their comrades. The courage of helicopter pilots who flew into the firebase under fire to evacuate wounded. And particularly the courage of men like Peter Lemon, who fought beyond the limits of physical endurance, who rescued wounded friends while wounded themselves, who refused to quit even when their weapons failed and they were reduced to fighting with their hands. That courage was characteristic of American soldiers throughout the Vietnam War. They fought in impossible conditions, in a war whose objectives were unclear and whose public support was crumbling. They fought anyway, because their friends needed them, because their mission required it, because they were soldiers, and that was what soldiers did. Firebase Illingworth represents both the best and the worst of the American experience in Vietnam. The best, incredible bravery, its effective tactical performance, soldiers rising to meet extraordinary challenges. The worst, a strategic approach that placed troops in vulnerable positions, casualties that were difficult to justify, a war that was increasingly recognized as unwinnable. 55 years after the battle, the veterans who survived Firebase Illingworth still gather to remember. They remember friends who died. They remember the fear, the chaos, the violence of that night. They remember holding the firebase against overwhelming odds. They remember the price paid for a piece of ground that was abandoned the next day. And they remember that when it mattered most, when their lives hung in the balance, they stood together and fought. That is what Firebase Illingworth means to the men who were there, not a strategic objective, not a tactical victory. Not a statistic in the history books, but a moment when they proved to themselves and each other what they were capable of enduring. The firebase is gone now, reclaimed by jungle decades ago. The bunkers collapsed, the berm eroded, the ground where 24 Americans died and 54 were wounded shows no sign of the battle that occurred there. But the memory persists in the men who survived, in the families of those who died, in the story of a desperate fight on a dark night in April 1970 when courage alone kept Firebase Illingworth from falling.